Hi and welcome to another episode of Family Matters. The government has said that it intends to overhaul the Adoption Act. Now, there have been ongoing calls for the law to be changed over many years, and the Human Rights Commission has complained about the Act. And in particular, they've complained about these components of the current law. The requirement for sole male applicants to prove special circumstances to the court before being permitted to adopt a female child. The ban on civil union partners or de facto couples to adopt. The ban on people under the age of 25 adopting. And for someone who has been adopted, their inability to obtain a copy of their original birth certificate until they are 20 years old. In other words, a closed adoption. Now, in 2016, I actually debated Labour's Justice spokesperson at the time, Jacinda Ardern, on this exact issue. You may have heard of Jacinda Ardern, although at the time she wasn't at all well known when we had this interview. Have a watch of this short debate on the AM show with Paul Henry. Oh, and watch for an interesting thing which happens towards the end of this important discussion, which is supposed to be focusing on adoption and children's rights. Somehow, the topic has changed to nuclear weapons and climate change.
In 1955, New Zealand had a population of around 2 million people. Sydney Holland was our Prime Minister. Homosexuality was illegal. It's also when our adoption laws were written and they haven't been revised since. Well, now the Human Rights Tribunal has labelled the 60-year-old laws discriminatory and is calling for urgent changes. They include giving same-sex, de facto and civil union partners the right to adopt and removing the requirement for single men adopting a female child to prove special circumstances. When there is no such requirement currently in the law for single females. Labour's Justice spokesperson Jacinda Ardern thoroughly agrees, but Family First National Director Bob McCoskrie says we need to protect our children and keep the laws as they are. They both join me now. Bob, Jacinda, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining us. Look, Jacinda, I'm going to come to you first. 60 years does seem like a long time. New Zealand has changed dramatically since then. What do you think are the most pressing issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah, well, it's actually the way the entire law is structured. So when it was first drafted, it was based on this idea of, single women who were having children, giving their babies away to strangers. Mm-hmm. So the way the law is drafted, it doesn't put, firstly, children at the centre of the law. It also means that when a child is adopted out, all of their biological relationships are severed. And that's actually just not how adoption works in New Zealand these days. So, for instance, whāngai adoption, which is common practice in New Zealand, is not supported by this law.
It's not recognised.
Never has been. It's not recognised. So actually, it's the structure of the law that needs to be changed. So yes, the Human Rights Commission has pointed out all of these bits of discrimination, but it's much broader than that. You haven't referred
to the most obvious one, I suppose, which is going to be one of the most contentious issues, which is the fact that the Human Rights Commission have essentially said that you cannot discriminate against either homosexual couples or even heterosexual couples on the basis they're not married.
And the reason, Paul, that I haven't raised that is because gay couples are able to adopt now. The only couples who are excluded by the law currently now are couples in civil unions, straight couples and gay couples. Now, look, that's absolutely an anomaly that needs to be fixed. But Bob's concern is misplaced because we already have gay couples raising children in New Zealand and doing a fantastic job.
Well, you are preempting Bob's concerns because he hasn't told us yet what they are, Jacinda.
I'm guessing.
Bob, what are your concerns here?
Well, let's go back to what the original purpose of adoption was, and that is that you have a child who has lost their natural birth parents, and so you're basically giving them a replacement family. Our argument is that they have a fundamental right to a mum and a dad. Who wants to tell a 7-year-old girl that we don't think she needs a mummy? So the Adoption Act did discriminate. I agree it does discriminate, but it needed to. For example, it said that a man couldn't adopt a little girl. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to see why that is probably a good guideline. It also said that you had to be at least 25. Once again, looking for maturity because taking on adoptee kids is hard work. So the discrimination was actually a good thing and it was a safeguard, and the Human Rights Commission wants to do away with that, and that's a dangerous ground.
Jacinda's made a very interesting point, though, in that at the moment, couples, whether they're homosexual or heterosexual, in a civil union relationship, cannot adopt.
No, nor can de facto either.
But isn't that ludicrous?
No, because I think the original intention of the Act was that they were looking for safeguards in terms of stability and commitment.
But
So they said
the
that
Act
the
is
best...
60 years old.
Well, that's okay. The needs of children haven't changed. They still want a mum and a dad, and they want commitment.
Society has changed.
Yes, and what we want for kids is a loving home, but where gender complementarity is very important, and most kids want that mum and the dad. So that's what adoption is about.
So fundamentally, Jacinda, then, I mean, Bob's main concern is that children should be given the right to have a mother and a father.
Yeah, and look, what I would say to that is all of the research and evidence now tells us that what children ultimately need is a stable, loving environment. And we know that these couples are providing that environment. But actually, put the research aside. Bob, there are 5,000 children in this country right now who are not in a family that is stable and loving. They are in the care of the state. Now, you cannot tell me that those children are better off in that situation than they are in the home of a gay couple who can provide them love and stability.
Okay, what do you say to that? What do you say to that?
No, nobody is saying that. I mean, we share that concern.
Well, you are.
The problem is that SIF have a anti-adoption policy.
Okay, so
and that is part of the problem.
There is truth in that.
But where do you put those children?
I just want to ask a question of both of you.
I want to put them with a mum and a dad.
Bob claims that there is no shortage of suitable married couples wanting to adopt.
No, there isn't.
Is that true?
I think the problem at the moment is that people wouldn't use the adoption laws because they're not fit for purpose. Because ultimately, as I said in the beginning, adoption laws sever the tie of biological families. So instead, the government's brought in Home for Life almost to paper over the fact that the law isn't fit for most family situations. That's why we need to reform it.
It's very hard to argue against that, isn't against that, because that's just bureaucracy that you're speaking there. I mean, at the end of the day, it is either true to say that there is no shortage of suitable married couples wanting to adopt, or it is false. So that is what Bob claims.
No, Paul, I would say we do have a large number of people who want to foster. Foster doesn't mean that they move on to adoption, because adoption, for instance, requires permission, and families often won't want to grant that. So it's about giving legal standing to those relationships. And at the moment, our adoption laws just aren't doing that.
Okay, and I don't want to get bogged down with this issue, but you see, the point that you made, Jacinda, which is absolutely right, there are children in diabolical situations, thousands upon thousands of them, who would dearly love to have any loving couple. You would agree with that.
Absolutely, we all agree with that.
But I don't think it's as a result of the adoption laws that they're not available for adoption, is it?
Yeah, but my point is that if Bob is saying that those gay couples aren't fit to raise children...
Nobody is saying that. We're saying what is the priority? And what is the best case example, and what is the purpose of adoption?
Okay, let me ask you a specific question, Bob.
And I'm saying there are plenty of children that need love, and we shouldn't discriminate.
And they also need gender complementarity. They want the mum and the dad.
Well, that's slightly at conflict with what you were saying just now,
Do you want to say to a 7-year-old girl, we don't think you need a mummy?
Bob, if you want to worry about the world imploding, worry about nuclear weapons and climate change, not gay couples.
Mummy.
Bob, if you want to worry about the world imploding, worry about nuclear weapons and climate change, not gay couples.
I just want to ask
you
a
not
very,
about gay
very
couples,
quick
because it's
question,
also
Bob.
heterosexual de facto couples that can't adopt as well. It's not a gay issue, Jacinda.
No, very quick question. Well, it is a gay issue when you talk about, a child deserves a mother and a father.
No, heterosexual de facto couples cannot adopt.
I know,
or
exactly.
Civil union
But let me just ask you this one quick question, Bob. Let me just ask you this one quick question, Bob. If you met a gay couple, and you know there are many, many, many gay couples, both males and females, who are perfectly competent, they're in a good, sound relationship, perfectly competent to bring up a child in a very loving relationship, would you have anything against them adopting a child?
Look, it's happened, and
would you have anything
couples
against
have brought
them adopting a child?
Look, we need to go back to the original protection of children in terms of what is their right.
So the answer to
what
that
is the right of children? We believe the right of children. Yes, because they don't have either a mum or a dad. And look, we all bemoan the problem of fatherlessness.
I thank you both very much for joining us. Jacinda Ardern, Bob McCoskrie.
Well, that was interesting. When you're debating someone on an issue and they change the topic to, nuclear weapons and climate change, it possibly means they've run out of argument. And you would have heard the disagreement around the status of de facto couples with adoption. Now, the courts have become what we might call activists in this area by reinterpreting the Adoption Act. In 2010, the High Court ruled in a specific case that a heterosexual de facto couple could adopt in this particular instance. And then in 2015, a family court extended it further to a same-sex de facto couple in this specific case. But that's not what the law explicitly says. These cases do not create a precedent. As I said in the debate with Jacinda, the current Act is focused on appropriate protections and the long-term welfare and rights of children. That would have been the focus on the politicians at the time, and rightly so. It's also important to note that New Zealand redefined marriage 3 years before this TV interview, and as a result, a married same-sex couple can adopt as of right because they're both deemed to be spouses by default. Now, as the adoption debate heats up, and it will, here's the bottom line. There may be room for tweaking the Adoption Act around the issue of open versus closed adoptions and better recognition of whāngai adoptions. One of the tweaks is around the right to your birth name, your nationality and your natural family, which would mean removing the cloak of secrecy around adoption. As we know, knowing who your natural family is very important. But what the demands to change the adoption rules are really about is focusing on the rights of adults rather than the rights of children. As I tried to say to Paul Henry, the purpose of adoption is not to provide a child for a family, but rather provide a family to a child. It's an important distinction. Adults' rights should not be the focus. So the age limitations and restrictions on gender are safeguards put in the original Act. There is discrimination, for good reason. A child has a right to a mother and a father. Yeah, we know death, divorce, disaster, they may not always deliver that. And sole parents should be honoured. But we should not set out in public policy to deliberately deny a child that basic right. Single parent and same-sex couple adoption, and we're talking about where there is no biological connection at all between a child and the adult, it intentionally creates motherless and fatherless families, all at the same time as we express concern at the high rates of absent fathers, fatherlessness, and the challenges for solo parents. The two most loving and capable women in the world simply cannot provide a dad, and two men cannot provide a mummy. That's the cold, hard, and inconvenient reality. This is not a sexuality issue, this is a gender issue. The gender of the parents matters to a child, which is why biology discriminates. It takes a mum and a dad to create a child. It's called gender complementarity. Let me close with this quote from Australian ethicist Tom Frame, who is the author of Children on Demand, The Ethics of Defying Nature. Nature dictates that a man and a woman are required for procreation, and this limitation should be acknowledged and respected because it discloses something of the purposes and providence of nature, that a child's best interests are served by it having a mother and father. As the government looks to adjusting our adoption laws, let's speak up and champion not the rights of adults, but the rights of children as being paramount.